You are a young bride, taken from your village at dawn, your fate sealed not by love, but by conquest. Dragged across the steppe, you know your body is no longer yours. In this world, women are not partners. They are spoils. In the harsh expanse of the 12th century Mongolian steppe, such stories were not rare. They were the rule. Nomadic clans fought not only for herds and territory, but for women's symbols of honor, wealth, and alliance. Marriage was rarely a union of affection. It was often the result of abduction, arranged exchange, or conquest. The secret history of the Mongols, the earliest surviving, Mongolian chronicle records case after case where women were seized as prizes, their value measured by beauty, fertility, and lineage. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, grew up in this unforgiving world. His childhood was marked by poverty and violence after his father was poisoned and his family cast out. In such an environment, survival depended on asserting dominance, and women were central to this power dynamic. The kidnapping of brides was a normalized custom, a practice so common that it shaped tribal politics. To capture a woman was to capture wealth. To lose one was to lose status. You can almost feel the terror of a girl as horsemen thunder into her camp, her family powerless, her body claimed in a transaction she cannot resist. This was not an isolated crime. It was a cultural mechanism. Every abduction reinforced the reality that female autonomy had no place on the steppe. The chronicles describe how Temujin himself experienced this brutality firsthand. His own wife, Bert, was abducted by a rival tribe shortly after their marriage. The incident was not unusual. It was expected. Recovery of abducted brides often fueled blood feuds and wars, binding the fates of women to cycles of violence they had no voice in shaping. Bert was eventually rescued, but the trauma of her abduction reflected the peril faced by every woman in this society. The normalization of such violence prepared the ground for what came next. Sexual dominance was not viewed as cruelty, but as the rightful extension of male power. Steppe culture treated women as living currency given in marriage to forge alliances, exchanged to settle debts, or seized to humiliate enemies. This system meant that when Temujin rose to power, he did not invent a new form of oppression. He inherited one, yet he wielded it with unprecedented scale and efficiency. His early life taught him that power and possession were inseparable, that a man's greatness was measured not only by the lands he conquered, but by the women he controlled. Imagine living in that world. Could you survive? Comment below. The secret history does not moralize. It records. It describes with cold precision how women were captured, assigned, or passed along. For the men of the steppe, these acts were transactions. For the women, they were violations. Each abduction was not just an act of war, but the destruction of a life story. Sexual violence was not a side effect of Mongol expansion. It was ingrained in the cultural DNA long before Genghis Khan emerged. What made him different was his ability to transform personal violence into imperial policy. But once Temujin became Genghis Khan, the violence of one man became the law of an empire. Every city that fell to the Mongols paid not only in blood, but in women's bodies. The storm of conquest did not stop with burning walls or toppled rulers. It reached into homes, tore families apart, and reduced daughters, wives, and mothers into living trophies of war. When Genghis Khan's armies thundered across Asia in the early 13th century, their power was measured not only in corpses, but in captives. Persian chroniclers such as Atamalik Juvaini, writing in the history of the world conqueror, described the aftermath of cities like Nishapur and Bukhara. Tens of thousands slaughtered, and alongside the dead, wave upon wave of women rounded up, divided, and parceled out like cattle. The most beautiful were reserved for the Khan and his generals. The rest were distributed among the rank and file as rewards for loyalty and bloodshed. This was not random chaos. It was policy. The Mongol system of conquest fused military discipline with systematic exploitation. Sexual slavery served three purposes: to humiliate the conquered, to bind warriors to their leader, and to expand the Khan's dominion through forced reproduction. You can almost feel the despair of a mother clinging to her child as Mongol soldiers drag her away, her screams drowned out by the clash of hooves and steel. In these moments, survival meant silence. Resistance invited death. Submission became the only fragile shield. The scale is staggering. Chroniclers tell of entire populations divided by gender. Men slaughtered en masse. Women and girls herded into camps. Captivity itself became an economy. Records note how women were bartered, exchanged, or gifted to secure the allegiance of lesser commanders. For the Mongols, the bodies of women were not only plunder, they were currency. In Bukhara, Juvani recounts how women were paraded before Mongol leaders, who selected among them with cold detachment. What was celebrated in Mongol chronicles as the spoils of victory was, in reality, the destruction of generations of families. The public display was deliberate. It signaled to the defeated that no aspect of their lives was beyond the conqueror's grasp, not their rulers, not their homes, not their women. History often hides these truths. Make sure you don't. The pattern repeated from China to Persia, from the steppes to the gates of Europe. Conquest was never only about land. It was about domination in its most intimate form. Women became living symbols of power, their subjugation woven into the empire's foundation. This was not a crime of passion. It was a machinery of control. By seizing women, the Mongols reinforced their warriors' loyalty and terrorized their enemies into submission. The violence was both personal and political, private and public. In the chronicles, the voices of the women themselves are almost entirely absent. They vanish into silence, their fates recorded only in numbers, never in names. Yet their suffering was the hidden backbone of empire, an empire built not only on conquest of land, but conquest of flesh. And at the center of this vast machinery of sexual conquest was one man. Within the walls of his orju, Genghis Khan ruled over an empire of silence, his harem. Beyond the thunder of armies and the carnage of conquest, another dominion existed, hidden yet absolute. Here, in the guarded quarters of his camp, women taken from every corner of Asia lived under the shadow of the great Khan. Sources speak of hundreds, sometimes thousands of women, gathered not by choice, but by force. Chronicles reveal how, after each campaign, the most beautiful were selected and brought into the Khan's household. Behind palisades and felt tents, they were organized not as individuals, but as a system. The structure was rigid. At the top stood the senior wives, chosen for their noble birth or the alliances they secured. Chief among them was Bert, Genghis Khan's first wife, who retained a unique political influence, her sons forming the ruling lineage of the empire. Beneath the wives were concubines, women seized in war, their lives dictated by the Khan's desire or by the gift of their bodies to favored nobles. At the lowest tier were servants anonymous, voiceless, and without even the pretense of dignity. For those inside, existence was a paradox. The court outside glittered with the wealth of plunder, silks from China, silver from Khwarezm, jewels from Samarkand. Yet within the harem, silence reigned. Fear lingered in every glance, every movement. You can almost feel the weight of isolation, knowing your fate was sealed not by your will, but by conquest. Rotation was common. Women could be reassigned from Khan to prince, from noble to commander. Their bodies were tokens in a wider game of loyalty and reward. What might seem like private indulgence was, in truth, part of statecraft. By granting concubines, Genghis Khan tied his men to him more tightly than chains. Legitimacy cloaked this system. Among the Mongols, concubinage was customary, an accepted extension of male power. As the empire expanded into Islamic territories, the practice found further sanction. Islamic law, invoked selectively, permitted concubinage, providing a veneer of religious approval to what was, in essence, institutionalized sexual slavery. The empire fused conquest with custom, violence with legality. Even daughters of the Mongol elite were not spared the machinery of coercion. Many were married off to secure alliances, bound to foreign rulers as living treaties. They carried privilege, yet they too lived within the confines of a patriarchal design, valued less for themselves than for the political networks their marriages cemented. Imagine the contradiction: to live at the very heart of the world's greatest empire, yet to have no control over your own life, to wear garments of silk, yet to be silenced by fear. The harem embodied that duality: splendor on the outside, captivity within. The Mongol court celebrated its magnificence. Chroniclers recorded the power, the wealth, the expansion. But within the harem, the voices of the women remain absent. Their silence, preserved across centuries, is as much a testimony as any written record. But the harem was not enough. Genghis Khan sought to project his power into the very bloodline of humanity. Today, 1 in every 200 men alive carries the genetic legacy of Genghis Khan. It is a statistic so vast, so staggering, that it seems almost impossible. And yet, it is re-etched not in chronicles or archives, but in the DNA of humanity itself. In 2003, geneticists studying populations across Asia discovered a single Y-chromosome lineage. It stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the plains of Central Asia, from the Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bukhara to the distant borders of the Middle East. The pattern was unmistakable. One man, living in the 13th century, had left a genetic footprint that endures in more than 16 million men alive today. That man was Genghis Khan. How was such a legacy forged? Not by natural chance, not by ordinary inheritance. It was carved through conquest. With every city taken, women were seized, absorbed into the Mongol machine of dominance. Chronicles speak of them carried off by the thousands, delivered to commanders, or placed within the Khan's own household. Their bodies became instruments of political control and biological expansion. Imagine the scale of violation hidden beneath that single number. 16 million men alive today, each carrying a silent testimony to generations of women who never had a choice. Every genetic marker is not just data, it is a reminder of systemic abuse on a civilizational scale. Some scholars debate whether this genetic spread was intentional policy. Was Genghis Khan consciously embedding his bloodline into the populations he subdued? Or was it simply the byproduct of relentless sexual exploitation by him and his descendants? The truth may never be fully known, but the result is undeniable. The empire's conquests were not confined to land and wealth. They penetrated into the very biology of its victims. The Mongol system made this possible. Warriors rewarded with women. Nobles granted concubines. Captives transformed into breeders for the next generation of conquerors. Each act multiplied the reach of Mongol blood until entire regions bore its trace. The empire itself became a genetic empire. Cold science reveals what chronicles only hinted at. Behind the grandeur of Mongol victories lies the intimate horror of millions of private defeats, each woman's story erased, reduced to a statistic. The brutality of conquest did not end at the city gates. It entered the human lineage, ensuring the Khan's presence long after his empire fell. You may marvel at the statistic. You may recoil at the violence it conceals. But one fact is inescapable. The legacy of Genghis Khan is not only carved into history, it is inscribed into humanity's very DNA. And yet, even genetic domination was enforced by laws, customs, and faith. How do you normalize rape? You write it into law. You sanctify it with faith. That was the genius and the horror of the Mongol Empire. Violence was not merely committed, it was legalized. It was blessed. It was systematized. At the center of this machinery stood the Yasa, the great code attributed to Genghis Khan. Its provisions were not written to protect the weak. They existed to enforce obedience to the Khan above all else. His will was law. His desire was justice. His command unquestionable. Under such a system, the taking of women was not an aberration. It was the very definition of order. If the Khan demanded, no law could deny him. If his generals rewarded soldiers with women, no statute condemned them. The Yasa transformed brutality into legality. Conquered peoples found themselves absorbed into this framework. Women became commodities within the empire's bureaucracy. They could be claimed as booty, traded between nobles, or gifted as tokens of loyalty. The language of property replaced the language of personhood. Archival references describe women delivered in quotas, allocated like livestock. To resist was to resist the empire itself, an act punishable by death. But legality alone was not enough. Conquest required moral sanctification. As Mongol dominion spread into Islamic territories, jurists and clerics were drawn into the machinery. Concubinage, already present in Islamic jurisprudence, was invoked and expanded. Religious rulings declared the practice permissible, framing it not as abuse, but as lawfully sanctioned possession. This fusion of steppe custom and Islamic doctrine gave the Mongols what they needed, a shield of faith to cloak systemic exploitation. The result was devastating. A girl seized from Nishapur or Samarkand was no longer a victim in the eyes of the law. She was a concubine, a legal wife in miniature, sanctified by custom, tolerated by scripture. Her suffering became invisible. Her status erased her voice. This normalization created what historians call the bureaucracy of rape. It was not chaos. It was administration. Records, rulings, and decrees smoothed the edges of brutality until atrocity appeared routine. Judges upheld it. Clerics rationalized it. Officials enforced it. Each level of authority added another layer of legitimacy, insulating the empire from moral challenge. To question the practice was to question both the Khan's command and the sanction of religion. Few dared. And yet, beneath this facade of law and faith, the human cost was incalculable. Every legal justification concealed the terror of women taken from their homes. Every clerical ruling silenced the screams of those forced into beds they could not escape. The empire had perfected a system where even horror could be made to look like order. Law gave permission. Faith gave absolution. Together, they created a world where atrocity could masquerade as justice. But no system of justification could silence the voices of horror that emerged from the ruins. Listen to the voices of the conquered echoes of women who are never meant to be remembered. They come to us not as cries, but as words in fragile manuscripts. Words that survived where bodies did not. Persian chroniclers like Abd-al-Malik Juvani recorded the aftermath of the Mongol conquests. He wrote of Nishapur, or after the massacre of hundreds of thousands, the surviving women were seized. The most beautiful were paraded before the Mongol commanders. The rest were handed to soldiers, their fates sealed in silence. His account does not soften the horror. It states plainly that rape was as systematic as slaughter. From Merv, another testimony. A city once known as the Queen of the World, reduced to ash. Chroniclers recount how women and children were gathered like spoils, apportioned among the victors. The plunder was not only of gold or livestock, it was of human dignity. Across the steppes and into Europe, the pattern repeated. In Kiev, when the Mongols stormed the city in 1240, Eastern Slavic sources describe devastation so complete that women were carried away in droves. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who survived entered captivity stripped of name, family, and freedom. The testimonies remind us, conquest was measured not only in bodies killed, but in bodies broken. Even Western envoys who encountered the Mongols returned with stories of terror. The Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, sent by the Pope in 1245, noted that captives were divided by age, skill, and beauty. He observed that the most prized were given to Mongol leaders, while the rest were distributed as slaves. His words confirm what Persian accounts had already made clear. Sexual violence was not the byproduct of war. It was its strategy. Imagine yourself among them. The gates of your city burned, your family slaughtered, and you hurried with hundreds of others into a pen of captives. You do not know whose hands will claim you. You only know that no law, no faith, no mercy stands between you and your fate. These testimonies strike with raw intensity because they preserve what statistics erase. Behind every number, whether thousands taken at Nishapur or tens of thousands at Merv, was a single face. A girl stolen from her wedding, a mother torn from her child, a daughter forced into the tent of a stranger. Historians remind us that silence dominates the sources. For every chronicler who dared describe, countless more voices vanished. Women rarely left their own accounts. Their trauma survives only in the words of men who watched from the outside. And yet, through these fragmented echoes, the horror becomes undeniable. The Mongol Empire was built not only with swords and horses, but with the suffering of the conquered inscribed into its very foundations. Each testimony is a window into lives deliberately erased. And yet, despite the horror, Genghis Khan was celebrated as a world maker. History remembers Genghis Khan as a unifier, a strategist, a visionary. But for millions of women, he was their nightmare. Across textbooks, he is celebrated as the man who forged the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. His name is etched into narratives of genius, discipline, and statecraft. He is hailed as the great unifier of the steppe. Yet beneath the glory lies a silence so vast it has swallowed the screams of entire generations. The truth is unavoidable. Genghis Khan was not only a conqueror, he was a predator. His victories were measured not just in cities burned, but in bodies taken. His empire did not simply expand through military brilliance. It expanded through systematic sexual violence, sanctified by law and normalized by faith. Scholars estimate that his genetic legacy is visible even today, carried in the DNA of millions. Some frame this as proof of virility, but the reality is darker. Each strand of that genetic footprint tells a story of coercion, assault, and women forced into bearing the children of their conquerors. What science records as lineage, history must name for what it was: violation. And yet, memory is selective. Chronicles written under Mongol patronage glorified him as the scourge of God, a force of destiny. Later historians in Europe admired his administrative reforms, his religious tolerance, his postal networks, his meritocracy. Few paused to weigh the cost borne by those who had no voice. Greatness eclipsed suffering. Imagine standing among the ruins of Merv, Nishapur, or Kiev. For you, the empire was not a marvel of trait, roots, and order. It was the ashes of your home, the slaughter of your kin, the hand that dragged you into captivity. Yet in the centuries that followed, the world remembered him as a world maker, not as your destroyer. This is the paradox of power. The victims vanish into obscurity, while the victor becomes legend. Historical greatness, we are told, requires brutality. But what is the worth of empire when it is built on the backs of women, stripped of name and dignity? The Mongol Empire standardized conquest as policy. It legalized sexual predation through the yasa. It cloaked atrocities in religious justification when entering Islamic lands. And it celebrated the Khan's will as divine mandate. This is not incidental. It is central. For the man remembered as the Great Khan, greatness and predation were inseparable. Even today, statues rise in his honor. Airports bear his name. He is invoked as a symbol of strength, leadership, and ambition. Yet in these commemorations, one half of his legacy remains buried. The women who suffered are not remembered in stone, nor honored in memory. Their lives are reduced to footnotes, if they appear at all. To call him the world's greatest conqueror is to accept his violence as the price of greatness. To call him a predator is to confront the silence that has protected his myth for 800 years. Both truths stand together, inseparable, in the shadow of his empire. And that leaves us with a question that echoes across centuries. What we call normal today may one day be judged as barbaric. Centuries ago, entire societies accepted rape as spoils of war. They wrote it into law. They blessed it through faith. They normalized what, to us, seems unimaginable. To live under the Mongol Empire was to exist in a world where human dignity could be erased by decree, where women became currency, where suffering was not an aberration, but routine. And yet, at the time, few called it wrong. Chronicles recorded the victories of armies, not the cries of the violated. Jurists justified. Officials administered. Communities endured in silence. What was atrocity became policy. What was horror became custom. What was barbarism became normal. Now, step back. Look at today. Ask yourself, what do we accept without question? What practices are written into our own systems, hidden behind bureaucracy, economics, and faith? Which silences do we preserve? Think of modern slavery millions trapped in forced labor, unseen yet essential to global supply chains. Think of children trafficked across borders, bought and sold in a trade as vast as any empire's. Think of sexual exploitation, industries that thrive on coercion, yet are dismissed as commerce. Each defended by law, shielded by profit, ignored by those who look away. For those living inside these systems, it feels ordinary, just as it once did under the Mongols. But history teaches a cruel lesson. The crimes most accepted in their own time are the ones most condemned in hindsight. You, standing centuries later, judge the Mongol world with clarity. You recoil at the rape of cities, the enslavement of women, the silence of scholars. But can you see with equal clarity the injustices around you now? Or are you blinded by the same normalization that once excused empire? This is the haunting legacy of history. It does not only expose the brutality of the past, it reveals the blindness of the present. The Mongol Empire is not merely a distant warning, it is a mirror, a reflection of how power, law, and faith can be weaponized to make atrocities seem natural. And so, the question passes to us. What will future generations say of this century? Will they condemn our prisons, our wars, our treatment of the poor? Will they look at our exploitation of the vulnerable and name it barbarism? The Mongols remind us, greatness without morality is nothing but conquest. Law without justice is nothing but control. And faith without conscience is nothing but silence. So pause, reflect, consider the weight of what we normalize today. Because one truth is inescapable. History always renders its judgment. What practices today will future generations call barbaric? Leave your thoughts below. And so the question remains, what horrors of today will future generations look back on as normal?